So there'll be some music, and then I'll get it.
Mm-hmm.
The radical, fundamental principles of freedom, rational self-interest, and individual rights. This is the Yaron Brook Show.
All right, everybody, welcome to Yaron Brook Show on this Saturday afternoon. I'm super excited to have as my guest today Flemming Rose. It's been a long time since we've talked, so just having an excuse to have an opportunity to talk to Flemming it makes this fun and makes this enjoyable. So I'm looking forward to this. We're going to be talking about primarily free speech, but feel free to ask questions about other topics, related to Flemming. I'll just quickly give you a little bit of background, but we will get during the interview into more of the background. Flemming, you're still a senior fellow at the Cato Institute? That's
No, I'm not. Well, nominally, I'm still on the website, but
okay.
I'm
so
not.
Tell us a little bit about what you're doing now. You said you're part of a new media company in Denmark.
Yeah, I'm the editor-in-chief of digital media that we founded 2.5 years ago almost, and it's called the Freedom Letter. And I write a weekly newsletter. It's also in an app, and it's on sound, called Free Thinking.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'm doing two podcasts, one related to the war in Ukraine. It's called Free Ukraine, where I'm the co-host. I mean, I was a correspondent in first the Soviet Union and then Russia in the 90s and noughties. And I'm also doing a podcast with a former top official in the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who was posted in Washington, Beijing, and Berlin. And it's called Fritt's Diplomatic Post. Fritt is his first name, so okay. It's in his name, yeah. So that's basically what I'm doing. But of course, I'm still following the free speech debate, even though it's a sad story. Yaron.
It's a sad story. It's only gotten worse.
I think you and we met first in Boston 17 years ago, in I think October 2006.
I think that's right. So Flemming and I met after he published the famous Danish cartoons, and we'll talk about that in a minute, in a newspaper that he was the cultural editor and foreign affairs editor at the time. And the Anwen Institute at the time, there was a horrible response to the cartoons, both in terms of how the Muslim world responds, but also how the media responded in the United States and elsewhere. So we took it up as a free speech issue, and that's how we met. We met at a variety of free speech events that we sponsored, and we've stayed in touch over the years and done many events, both in Europe and in the United States over the years around this issue. So I want to delve deeply into this free speech issue. It really has come now to the forefront. We were talking before the show around the Danish government considering, and I think the Swedish government is also considering banning the burning of the Quran. So that is the latest.
In fact, not, Yaron. The Swedish government is not going to do this because they have recognized that it is contradicting their constitution.
Good.
And it's a big irony, because if you go back to the cartoon crisis, and I had to extend my thanks to you and the Tyranny Institute back then, because that was a difficult time for me. So I really appreciate your support back then and your interest in these matters. No, the irony here is that in Denmark and Sweden, we are neighbors. And we have always considered ourselves as a freer country in Denmark than Sweden. And this has been especially the case around the debate about immigration, where Denmark has, we have had that debate in a far more frank and direct way than in Sweden. But here it turns out that Sweden, in fact, even though I mean, there's far more at stake for Sweden than for Denmark, because one of the reasons Sweden is debating this is because they are applying for NATO membership, and the Turkish president Tayyip Recep Erdogan has said, you will not get into the club unless you punish these people. Then at some point he's maybe changed his mind, but we don't know, because the Turkish parliament still has to vote on this. So we'll have to wait and see. But so far it seems that Sweden will not pass a law similar to the one that will be proposed in Danish parliament when our parliament convenes in the beginning of October.
And what do you think is the probability that it passes?
It's almost certain.
Okay.
Because, of course, anything can happen in politics, but the fact of the matter is that this is a majority government. They hold a majority in parliament, so they don't have to make any compromises or changes if they agree among themselves. There now is a process where civil society actors can supply, their proposals, propose changes, make references to international law, human rights conventions, precedents, and other stuff. But I think I think it's pretty certain at this point. There might be minor changes.
Yeah.
One of the big, it's an incredible law proposal, and I should just remind our viewers that Denmark, in fact, we got rid of our blasphemy law in 2017. And that blasphemy law had been on the books, since forever. But it had been a sleeping law. Nobody had been convicted in Denmark for blasphemy since 1946. Even though, some Muslims organizations in Denmark, they tried to take me and the newspaper that I worked at back then, Jyllands Posten, to court, but that was civil cases, and they lost all of them. So this is really, I think, a game changer in terms of the status of free speech in Denmark. We still have to see how this is going to play out in reality, but the reason why I'm saying that they might make changes is because they have included art into the law proposal.
I was going to ask you, how extensive is it? It's not just the Quran. It includes.
It is. No, it's not. It's not only the Quran, because you can't do that. That would be discrimination against other religions. But I still think it is a very discriminatory law, because it doesn't protect what non-believers hold important.
Sure.
It's a law that wants to criminalize improper treatment of holy books.
Wow.
Or books that faith communities hold sacred. Holy books and religious symbols. So, it might also be a crucifix. And you might know Andres Serrano's famous installation called Piss Christ.
Yep.
I think it's from '87, and Andres Serrano. I mean, it's a crucifix with an image of Christ in human urine.
Yep.
His own, as far as he is telling. But the irony here is that he is in fact a Catholic himself. And it's not in order to mock Christianity. It is in fact to depict the suffering of Christ on the cross. That's just one example, and there is another one. I was in New York in 2018, and I went to a gallery down in Chelsea where there was a retrospective exhibition with the late British conceptual artist. His name is John Latham. And people can Google this if they want to while we are speaking. And the installation is called "God is Great," and it is a copy of the Bible, the Quran, and the Talmud, torn into pieces and layered in a piece of glass. And Latham did that work in many versions in the aftermath of the First Gulf War. Mm-hmm. Order to depict a situation where these holy books are very vulnerable to outside exploitation for all kinds of reasons. But this is just two examples.
But so the law would ban these. The law would say this is illegal because it desecrates a holy book to a particular community, or in this case, all three communities.
Yeah, I mean, we'll have to wait and see, because the government has been very eager to say that they don't want to introduce censorship against art. But the problem is, as one director of a very famous art museum in Denmark said, the politicians in Denmark, they have no clue about how art has developed within the past 2, 3, 4 decades. Yep. So-called performance art. We have an Iranian woman of Iranian descent in Denmark who is in fact tearing the Quran apart in front of the Iranian embassy in order to demonstrate her outrage against the suppression of women within Iran. And the Minister of Justice, when he was confronted with this example, he said, "Oh, I think she better find another way to express herself." Yeah. Which, of course, is an incredible arrogance. And
that's part of what we don't want. We don't want the courts and politicians deciding what art is and what it isn't, what counts as expression and what counts as. And once they start banning expression, there's no limit to it. There's no end to it.
I mean, we have some very disturbing precedents in history. When you have done this in different parts of the world, and what kind of political regimes do these things. And here you have a government in a country that labels itself a liberal democracy. So I think it also it says a thing or two that even in a democracy, if you give politicians the right to do whatever they want, it's quite often very difficult to differentiate between the way politicians are acting in a democracy and in a non-democracy. And that's why we need constraints and limitations on government.
Yeah, I think what saves the United States is not our politicians. What saves the United States is that we have a constitution with the First Amendment and courts that are still respected and still uphold it, at least for the most part.
Yeah, true.
So,
sorry.
Yeah, I was going to say, how did we get here? So maybe we could do a little bit of history of this idea of free speech in Europe in particular. Europe, which is considered, free speech in a sense. So the concept was invented in Europe. It is an Enlightenment idea coming out of the Enlightenment. What happened in Europe?
Basically coming out of the walls of religion, I would say. Yeah. That because quite often there is this contradiction, some people say, between the right to freedom of religion and the right to freedom of expression, and that tolerance is somehow in some kind of tension with freedom. The fact of the matter is that they are all different sides of the same coin. I think it's easier to understand in the United States because in the First Amendment, you unite the right to free assembly, the right to freedom of religion, and the right to freedom of speech within, one article, the First Amendment. But in Europe, there is a different understanding. But if you go back and look at history and the way the concept of religious tolerance came into the world, it is basically Protestant and Catholics killing each other for decades, and finally, settling on this concept of religious tolerance first. But just to give an indication, how difficult this is. When this concept was introduced in parts of Europe, especially Germany, France, the Netherlands, and other countries as well, tolerance of people belonging to a different faith implied that the minority, yes, we do not kill you anymore, but if you want to practice your faith, you have to do it, in the basement, so nobody can see you. And later there was this agreement that the minority, they could go outside town and celebrate their version of Christianity, but they could not do it within the town itself. And then you had Catholics and Protestants living in different parts of the town. They did not interact, even though you had this concept of tolerance. So, and finally today you can have Catholics, Jews, Christians, Protestants, Muslims, Buddhists, non-believers living in the same block.
Sure.
But it's just to give you an indication that people think that tolerance is just about being nice and polite and turning the other cheek. I don't think so, and I also think that that tolerance involves a lot of pain, that it's painful to be exposed to ideas and opinions that you actively dislike. So I don't think we should romanticize free speech and tolerance. You and I believe in these concepts and we think they are worth fighting for, but I think we should not deny the fact that it's not easy, and sometimes it hurts.
So Europe, this is a very messy evolution as you're describing. It's a very messy process to go from a general idea of religious tolerance to slowly the acceptance of other religions and the acceptance of a broader of free speech. When do you think was kind of peak liberal Europe in the sense of accepting free speech? When was the best of times?
Well, I would say that the golden age might be 20 years from end of the 60s until maybe somewhere in the 90s. And of course, it's part of the young people. There were big young generations who wanted their way. I'm not saying that they were better people or anything like that, but but they were fighting against authority and the established order. And in order to do that, you had to be in favor of free speech. But of course, when they finally got into power, they turned to be less supportive of what they have had fought for earlier. But that's, maybe, Yaron, that's my biggest, most important takeaway from, the past almost 20 years I've been involved in this debate, that that it is true, I think, that every human being has a drive for freedom, that we want to be free, we strive to be free, but people tend to forget the other part, and that is that what we mean by that is that we want freedom for ourselves and for people who think
look like us,
and speak like us, but we don't want freedom for people with opposing point of views, and people, preaching a different faith or different political ideologies, and so on and so forth. And what really surprised me during this debate, was how vulnerable, in fact, freedom of speech is. I belong to a generation, I grew up in the 70s, and I, worked as a correspondent in the Soviet Union, and I was very critical of that regime. I cooperated with dissidents who had been imprisoned and who had fled the Soviet Union for the West. So I kind of, I had this naive illusion that the support of free speech in the West was, very strong. But I've learned that that's not the case, and I think it has to do with human nature, and our social psychology, that we are a social animal. We belong to groups, we conform to groups, and we tend to demonize and ostracize out-group individuals, out-group ideologies, and we just want to shut them down. So free speech and tolerance, which is, in fact, free speech is conditioned on tolerance, I think, is not about nature, human nature. It's about culture. It's about education. It's about practicing. It's in fact something you have to learn. And because of our Stone Age brains, every time when somebody is saying something that really pisses you off, your instinct is, please shut up, or switch off the television and throw away the newspaper. That is our instinctive reaction, and that's our, it's so deep in our brain, and that's I think that's also why the battle for free speech can never be won, because there is so much within human nature that takes us in different directions.
So I think I'm more pessimistic and more optimistic than you. So I don't think human beings naturally strive towards freedom, sadly. But I do think we can win. Freedom and freedom of speech are achievements, and they require, as you said, they require real education and really thinking. And it took philosophers and it took thinkers and, post the religious wars, and it took the founding fathers in America to write a constitution. This is a major human achievements after 100,000 years of a species. And it's going to take a long time for this to become part of a sustained culture. You're right. The people are too tempted by kind of the laziness, I would call it, of the Stone Age mind, right? The laziness of not having to think and I think tribalism and this collectivism are lazy answers to challenges. It's again, when you don't have the self-esteem and the courage and the thoughtfulness to think for yourself, then it's easy to latch onto a group that will shield you and tell you what to think and tell you what to do. And that's the sense I don't think people strive to freedom. If freedom means individual freedom, they're much more likely. I use the example of Braveheart, the movie Braveheart, which I don't know if you've seen. And there's a scene in the movie where they're all yelling freedom and they're going into battle and they're fighting for freedom. And are they really there for freedom? What they're there for is they want a Scottish king to rule over them, not an English king to rule over them. It has nothing to do with freedom as we understand the concept. It has more to do with clan and tribe and things like that. So sadly, until we culturally eradicate that element from humanity, it keeps coming back.
Yeah, but I mean, so you are more optimistic in the sense that you believe that it is possible to win this battle for good, because my understanding is that every generation has to take its own battle for free speech, and if they don't do that, it's like going to the fitness center in a way. If you don't go to the fitness center, you will not be in good shape. And I think it's the same with free speech. If you don't practice it, then all these mechanisms, this tribal mechanism, this social psychology will just click in like this, because that is the default position.
I agree.
You agree with that?
I agree. So you have to continuously fight, but it's the same fight that I see more broadly. For people have to engage their mind. They have to think. They have to reason. Reason is the achievement. Once you do that, freedom of speech, I think, is obvious. It's a application, and we constantly have to fight to get people to think. But when you can get people to think, and once that becomes, I think, culturally habituated, then yes, you'll still have to engage in this, but it'll become a lot easier. And this is why I think the United States is a little bit better, only because, and it's got lots of problems, but only because it's instituted into, because of the Constitution, it was kind of became a part of the culture in a way that I don't think it became a part of it. So it's habituated into how Americans think about life and how Americans think about the world. I think that'll fade as people stop thinking, as people stop engaging with the effort, because it takes effort. You're never going to get to the point where it's where we have an instinct for free speech. That is not going to happen. It always will require thought and effort and energy, and in that sense, it has to be fought for every time anew. So
can I ask you a follow-up question?
Yeah.
Just to clarify, I mean, what do you mean by reasoning and thinking here? First, let me ask you that question first, Yaron.
So I think to reason is to observe reality using our senses, accept that there are facts, that there's truth. Use your mind to integrate those truths. So it requires an understanding that truth can only come from human reasoning, from logic, from thinking. It doesn't come from revelation. It doesn't come from the world of forms, the Platonic world of forms. It comes from the human mind engaging with reality. And certainly until Aristotle and until the Greeks, human beings didn't even think about it, right? Because they were too busy surviving, and philosophy didn't exist, and they didn't consider it. And then, of course, what's dominated most of human history over the last 2,000 years is religion. And religion, in a sense, is the opposite. Religion says, well, the truth is revealed. Conveniently, it's not revealed to everybody. So we have to rely on the people it's revealed to tell us what to do. And so people they didn't have to engage in thought. And I think the real change happened, it happened slowly, but during the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, individuals started to get the sense, I can think for myself. I can engage with reality. I can discover truth. I don't need authority. I don't need the church, but I also don't need a king. I don't need authority. And I think that explains the explosion of liberty, the explosion of freedom that happens during that period. Suddenly individuals, but they also realize that now that means personal responsibility. That means I have to think for myself. That means I have to engage in this thought. And I think that's why you get more individualism in the last 200 years than ever in human history. because of the realization that we are, each individual have a mind and can think and discover truth for oneself.
Okay. I mean, the way I look at this is because I just wanted your clarification, because you talk about reasoning and thinking, and I think basically, I mean, nobody can prevent you from thinking the way you want. The critical, point is where you take your thinking out into the world. So I think there is an important distinction between, thinking, speaking, and acting. And Natan Sharansky, whom I've had the privilege to interview a couple of times, he read this book. He wrote this book, The Case for Democracy, where he talked about what he calls doublethink. So you can think one thing and then you can say a different thing and do a third thing. And he basically says that in an oppressive society like the Soviet Union, you had some true believers who in fact believed in the ideology of the system, maybe 5-6%.
Yep.
Then you had, the true dissidents who were courageous enough to speak their minds in spite of the fact that they had to serve long prison sentences or were exiled or lost their jobs and things like that. And then you had, 85% in the middle, who in fact, if you ask them and said to them, there will be no consequences of whatever you say, then a lot of people would have joined the dissidents, but they didn't do so. So, they still had the freedom to think, but they did not dare to speak their minds publicly.
But I think the two are related. I think that when force is placed upon you, like it was in the Soviet Union, it's a very rare individual who not only speaks, but also really thinks. People might complain, they might be unhappy, they might not like the system, but are they really thinking? And if they're really thinking and they understand the full implication to their own life, I think more of them would be dissidents. And of course, if 85% were all dissidents, the system wouldn't exist. The system
and that's
would
what
crumble.
happened. That's exactly what happened when they took away, the punishment for speaking your mind. It turned out that 90% of or 70% of the population, they didn't want that system.
Yeah. But I agree with you that what matters in the end is the expression of that thought and the ability to express that thought, and that's what politics is about. It should be about protecting us, protecting our ability to express ourselves and to live in accordance with our own thinking. And of course, unfortunately, most political systems do the exact opposite. And it's to protect us. So going back to the Danish cartoons or going back to burning of the Quran, the political system should be there to protect you so that you can do cartoons, so you can burn Qurans, so you can do offensive things. So that you can express yourself, so you can act on your judgment, on your thinking, even if your thinking and judgment are wrong, stupid, irrational, as it often is. But I do think, there's a reason, I think, why, one of the reasons, I think, for example, why countries that are free, you find innovation and you find economic progress, in countries that are not free, you don't find that. And I think a big part of that has to do with thinking. That is, if you know that in order to get something done, you have to go through 5 committees and other people have authority over you, you have to ask permission, you just don't do it. You don't even start. Right. And so you suppress your own thinking. It's like self-censorship. The 85% of the people in the Soviet Union hated the system, but they didn't really want to really think it through. And they didn't know what alternative they wanted. They just didn't like what existed. And when they were given the opportunity, they marched, they acted. But they didn't have they didn't spend time as the dissidents did really articulating what it is about the system they didn't like. Because the incentive wasn't there. The incentive was to stay quiet, not think, do your job, keep your head low, and that expresses itself in every aspect of human life. So you need liberty to liberate the human mind, because the human mind won't function completely if it's just inside itself. It has to express itself ultimately in the world outside. So
I would just add that I mean, I agree with you in the sense that the vast majority of people in the Soviet Union, like in every other society, so we should not single them out, they are conformists. And I mean, the deeper reason for the disintegration of the Soviet Union, I mean, there were many, but I think the most fundamental was, of course, the disintegration of the economy. And you know, that's what the majority of people that's what motivates them. And when life gets worse and worse, when you have, you know, high inflation, salaries not being paid on time, and what you own is getting inflated, you cannot buy the goods you want, and so on and so forth, then that is, you know, the time when you have these revolutionary moments where, in fact, the masses can be put into motion, even though the ideas for this has been prepared by a very small group of people, many years and sometimes decades.
And it's always like that. If that small group happen to be good, maybe like the founding fathers in the United States, then what they put in place lasts a long time, and people conform to the good, and we get a good society, or relatively good society. If the people who start us off are bad, then people conform to the bad, sadly, and it's very hard. It's very hard to change, and it takes a crisis to change. But then the change, if the change is not intellectual, if the change is not fundamental about how they think about the world, then they just revert often to another form of conformity and authoritarianism. And I think maybe Russia is a good example of that, where, you know, we went from the Soviet Union to kind of a mafia state, but which the people kind of accept, right? Of oligarchs and you know, not a liberal free place, because it's hard to go from the one to the other without a real intellectual revolution.
Yeah. I made one note when you spoke about the United States. What is it that makes you more optimistic on behalf of the United States when it comes to free speech? I mean, I'm now watching this from a distance, and underlying our conversation about free speech is also the relationship between culture and law. And I agree absolutely with you that the United States has the best protection of speech in the world. And every time a case comes before the Supreme Court, they make the right decision, you know, as I understand it, in accordance with the First Amendment, that there can be no government, you know, interference with speech, except for very limited circumstances, and that's different in Europe. That's true. But when I look at the culture of free speech in the United States, I must say that you know, quite often I think it's in worse shape than in at least some part of Europe. What's your take on this, Yaron?
Yeah, no, I think I agree with you. I think the reason I'm optimistic, I'm not really optimistic, but the reason I'm more positive in the United States is because of that legal protection. We've got this really good court case right now in front of the, it's actually going to go to the Supreme Court, around the government's attempts to censor the social media, to tell social media what they can and cannot do. And the courts are ruling,
Twitter files.
Yeah, and the courts are ruling perfectly. The courts are ruling right. But I agree with you. There is a culture of self-censorship, There is a culture of lack of willingness to listen to opposing points of view of certain types. I think it's on both sides of the political spectrum, so it's not even unique to one. It's the far left is maybe worse on many regards, but the attitude of the right towards media and towards others is bad as well. It's without the Constitution, we would not have free speech in the United States. It would be gone by now. I think that's absolutely right. And the only thing saving us today are the courts. And not a good position to be in. Not a good position at all to be in. Yeah. So give me a sense in Europe. So you don't have the courts, but what's the culture like? So what is there less of this self-censorship? Is there less of this constraints on free speech?
I think that, usually from afar, you see Europe as some kind of homogeneous, unified place. And we have the European Union with, what is it now after Britain left? Is it 26 or 27 countries? But there are, 6 or 7 countries waiting to join. We'll see how that works out. So in that sense, Europe is in flux also because of the war in Ukraine and how to manage the relationship with Russia, both short term and longer term. But my point is that historically, I think that the strength of Europe has been that you had so many political entities in such a small space, so they could compete with one another and learn from one another, teach one another. If something isn't working in Denmark, it might work in the Netherlands. If it isn't working in the Netherlands, it might in Belgium, city-states in Germany, France, so on and so forth. So I think in that sense, this unification of Europe in certain respects, it kind of undermines the spirit, the foundational spirit of Europe that made it strong. This diversity in the way you organize your economy, your political system, and so on and so forth. So that's just to indicate that at a foundational level, I think Europe is very diverse, and it's very difficult to speak about Europe as some kind of unified entity, also in terms of free speech culture and even laws, in spite of the fact that the European Union is trying to impose, universal standards when it comes to speech. We still have some countries that have blasphemy laws. We have many countries who do not have blasphemy laws anymore. We do have some countries that have very far-reaching hate speech laws. Mm-hmm. And we have other countries where hate speech laws are not applied to the same degree. Yep. I would say when it comes to hate speech laws, which is a little bit strange, maybe because there is this Anglo-Saxon connection, that in United Kingdom, this is very, very far-reaching. Yeah. Where you have people being arrested for posting things online that somebody says is hate speech, even though it's legal. Mm-hmm. While I would say in a country like Norway, they have been very cautious when it comes to applying their hate speech law, and you are allowed to say things in Norway that you would never be allowed to say in Britain or in France. And just to make a final, comparison, the European Union has obliged every member of the Union to introduce laws criminalizing Holocaust denial. Yep. But we have not done that in Denmark. Norway has not. not done that. And we well, then the irony is that many countries in the former Eastern Bloc, they do not remember the Holocaust. What they remember is the oppression by a communist regime.
Yep.
And a communist regime that that killed minorities, one minority or another. So when they were forced to introduce laws against Holocaust denial, they said, okay, but then we'll also have to introduce a law criminalizing denial of the crimes of communism. And then somebody came up with a law, okay, if you want to do that, then we also want to introduce a law criminalizing the denial of the occupation of Latvia by first Nazi Germany and then communist Soviet Union. So these memory wars have really been triggered by Holocaust denial laws, and it has also inspired both Russia and Bangladesh to introduce very tough laws. In fact, with reference to European Holocaust denial laws. Back in 2014, the Russian parliament passed a law criminalizing defamation of the Red Army during World War II.
Yep.
With reference to the German law.
Yep.
And in Bangladesh, they have introduced a law criminalizing minimization of the number of victims during the Civil War back in the beginning of the 70s, even though the official number probably, in fact, is wrong.
Yeah.
It's far less. So in that sense, Europe has inspired not only new members of the European Union, but also faraway countries. And of course, that is bad. And I think in general, we have many more legal limitations on speech than you do in the United States, and it's getting worse. And speaking about this probably coming law against improper treatment of objects considered sacred for faith communities, I think, in fact, that proposal is connected to the broader international geopolitical situation. You may know that the OIC, the Organization of Islamic Countries, they have within the UN system for decades tried to implement a new international human rights standard, accepting that blasphemy is a human rights violation. And they have tried to compare and equalize hate speech with blasphemy. That is, if you criticize a religion, it's like racist speech.
Yep.
And I would say, I'm strongly against this law. I think it's stupid and unwise for so many reasons. But I also have to acknowledge, as a free speech advocate, that it's far easier to argue for the right to publish cartoons of the Prophet Mohammad than it is to argue for the right to burn books. Because at least within a European tradition, burning books that gives us very bad associations, even though, of course, there is a huge difference between burning books, where this is introduced by the government within a totalitarian society that is genocidal, and then burning books as a kind of political statement within a liberal democracy where minorities are protected by law.
And of course, once you bridge the rights for expression, the right to action like this, where no physical force is actually being applied to anybody, it's a slippery slope, and we know that slippery slopes exist. In a sense, what you said earlier, I mean, all of the free speech issues in Europe seem to have started with the Holocaust denial, the laws against Holocaust denial right after World War II in Germany, and that kind of sets the precedent for everything else.
In fact, not because that Yaron, that was one of my big surprises when I looked into this, because during the cartoon debate, a lot of people said to me, "Oh, you have to be aware, what happened to the Jews in Europe, and now the Muslims are the Jews of Europe, and what you are doing is very similar to anti-Semitic cartoons." So I looked into this issue, and it turns out that in fact, yes, you had similar laws in Germany like that, but it wasn't laws against Holocaust denial. In fact, they had a law against defaming the memory about deceased people or something like that. The Holocaust wasn't in fact mentioned specifically. The Holocaust denial laws, that wave began after the fall of the Berlin Wall.
Interesting.
So after 1989.
Yeah,
that's astonishing. I mean, for many years, there was no talk about criminalizing denial of the Holocaust in most European countries. No, this is in fact an act of the European Union in the aftermath of the fall of the Berlin Wall, and part of some kind of new, I would say, universal value system where the memory about the Holocaust is key. But my argument against this is, I mean, if you look at the Holocaust and all the genocides that happened during World War II, they happened, due to first cooperation between two totalitarian regimes, Stalin Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, and then the fight against one another, where both of them eliminated ethnic, religious, other kinds of minorities on their territories. So if you really wanna be consistent in your memory and reading of those events, then your reply to the Holocaust as happening due to how two totalitarian powers acted, then your key point should be, we have to insist on free speech. We have to insist on fighting for everything that goes against the logic of totalitarian regimes. But we ended up, in fact, doing otherwise.
So going back to the culture in Europe, are there parts of Europe where the culture of free speech is healthy or relatively healthy as compared to other parts of Europe?
I mean, I still think the culture of free speech in Denmark is pretty strong, and even though the government has a majority in parliament, there is a very vocal opposition to this proposal, and a lot of people are speaking out, even though the government, I mean, they are playing the security card, as in fact was also the case during the cartoon crisis, that if we do this, terrorist acts might be committed, it might undermine our national security, and so on and so forth.
Fear is a powerful motivator. Fear is a powerful motivator.
We can talk about that because that's also one of the things I learned. And you had the same in the US after 9/11 with the Patriot Act. If you can frame an issue about privacy or about freedom as a matter of life and death, and life is about security, and death is, if you allow free speech, and if you don't have the right to violate people's privacy, we will all, might all be dead at some point. Then everybody will vote for security, and that is exactly the way non-democratic governments operate all the time. But the fact of the matter is that if you prioritize security every time, you have to make this choice, then you will end in a police state. And life by definition is dangerous. We are all going to die at some point. So you have to be willing to take certain risks in order to have freedom to speak your mind. Even though, if you trigger the right buttons and trigger certain fundamental instincts in human nature, and we saw that during COVID. In all liberal democracies, people were willing to sell out immediately. So no, but I just want to say that I think United Kingdom I think free speech culture there is really in danger. I think in Germany historically, but in Germany there is a very strong philosophical tradition, speaking about reason, and history of ideas. So in fact, in many ways, the Germans are quite rational. So even though they have this history and they have these awful laws, you can still have a quite free debate, I think, in Germany. When it comes to France, they're very good on the right to criticize religion. We know Charlie Hebdo.
Yes.
We all admire Charlie Hebdo. But that's because of their history. They had this fight between the Catholic Church that was very powerful and society. So the French have a very vivid memory of the way religion and institutionalized religion can be used to oppress speech. And that's also why their religious satire is so vile and very, you could never find religious satire in the United States the way you have it in France.
But my understanding was that the French government was going after Charlie Hebdo at some point, and they regarding some of these what they considered hate speech that Charlie Hebdo was engaged in.
In fact,
was that not true?
No, they have not been prosecuted, and I think the French government has been very supportive, and I think it's very interesting. When we have this proposal in Denmark about burnings of holy books, the former French ambassador to Copenhagen, who was present at a public meeting about blasphemy that was attacked by a terrorist, and one individual was killed.
I remember that
back in 2015.
I remember that.
He came out now criticizing the Danish government and saying, I love Denmark, but I think this is really wrong. So, but another thing is that within French societies, there are Charlie Hebdo is still dividing the public, but I mean they have been supported by the government. They have very heavy security.
And do you feel safe today? I remember the days where you traveled with two big Danish
well,
bodyguards.
Not only two. Yeah. No, I can't complain, Yaron. I live in a country where, which is quite unusual. I'm not a politician. I'm not a member of the royal family. I'm not. I'm not on the on the usual nomenclatura of people who have a right to protection, and in spite of that, the Danish government and the Danish police has taken care of my security during all those years. So I mean, I feel very privileged. You know, I mean, of course, you know, it's not easy to live with that level of security, but I'm very grateful to the Danish government that they took, you know, this task upon them. If I had been living in the United States, I would have had to pay for this for myself, which would have been impossible.
We saw what happened to Salman Rushdie.
Exactly, and that's, you know, that's even though, I mean, I don't feel any immediate threat to my life at this moment, not at all, and I don't think that the Danish police or intelligence service, you know, see any red lights blinking, but I've always been, you know, of the opinion that there is no expiration date for this, and the attack on Salman Rushdie to me was exactly a reminder of that fact, that you yeah, it I mean, you can never be sure. Also, because of the internet, it turns out that this young man, I mean, he was not alive, I think, when the Satanic Verses were published, and you only read about this on the internet or whatever. And he was even, I think, maybe, was he born in Lebanon or was he born in the United States? So he had no immediate relationship to that part of the world. So no, I think you have to accept that you shouldn't kid yourself in the sense that just because you don't feel an immediate threat now, that at some point some crazy person, you know, might show up and do something.
Yeah, that's the sad state of the world. So we have some questions here from some of the listeners. Let's see, this is for Flemming. Does the proposed law prohibit the actual burning of holy books or also computer-generated simulation videos? Is this an issue? Is there a more general movement to censor visual experiences? Do you know?
Yeah, yes, I know. Yes, there. For instance, there was a case in France, and this is also where the Danish government is transparent and honest, because they say that in all other countries this is forbidden. They also point to France, and it is true that if you burn the Quran in a public space in some places in France, you can be prosecuted, but that is a violation of public order. It's not about, you know, holy books and things like that. And in fact, there was a guy who burned the Quran and took a video of it and put it online, and he was acquitted.
Okay.
But the Danish government is also trying to include this kind of exercising your free speech, and they're also including not paintings, not cartoons, not sculptures, but the point is that they have not included performance art, performative art. I mean, if you and a lot of modern art is done that way, you know, installation, some kind of theatrical performance, and so in theory they I mean, at the current stage, this kind of art would also be included, but they have received a lot of criticism, so I think they might want to exclude this. But the reason why they're doing this is because, you know, Yaron, where is the limit between art and not art? And I mean, do we want a judge to decide what is art, or what isn't art, what is fiction, or what isn't fiction? Of course not. but they have done this because they want to prevent a situation where, you know, the individuals who at the current moment are doing these performances with Qurans should not be able to say, "Oh, this is artistic performance."
Yeah. No, I mean,
you cannot go after.
This is why we have to be absolutist with regard to these issues, and you know, you have free speech. It's how you express it, whether through art or through performance or through just an article or a speech or burning. As long as you're not using physical force on others, the state has no business. The state had no business in it.
Yeah, and speaking about the slippery slope, because the interesting thing here is, you know, they want to exclude cartoons because of the cartoon incident, and other kinds of expressions that might be offensive to believers. And then Danish media, you know, they approached Muslim communities in Denmark and asked them, you know, if we ban Quran burnings, would you also see cartoons or you know, other kinds of expressions targeting religion as offensive? And they said, of course. I mean, you shouldn't only ban Quran burnings; you should also ban X, Y, Z, and so on and so forth.
So Francisco asked, could you give an example where it's okay to limit free speech? Is the threat of a terrorist attack enough of a reason?
Yeah, I mean, in that sense, I'm not a free speech absolutist, in the sense that I don't think that there isn't any legitimate restrictions on free speech. Many, I mean, fraud. You are not allowed to lie in court, for instance, perjury. I don't think you should legalize incitement to violence. I think people have a right to privacy as long as they are not public figures. So and the media should only have a right to you know, to investigate people's private lives, is if it is somehow relevant for what they are doing, if they are elected officials, or it is somehow connected to what they are doing in the public arena. I'm in favor of viewpoint neutrality, and that is one of the distinctions between Europe and the United States. That in Europe we tend to criminalize certain opinions, or certain viewpoints, while in the United States you cannot criminalize speech just based on the content of speech. But we do that in Europe, and I think that is not a good thing.
Yes, I agree with that. I mean, defamation, fraud, and incitement are clearly, you know, not protected. In the concept of free speech. But you're asking about, I mean, Francisco here is asking, is the threat of terrorist attack enough of a reason? No, I mean, that is blackmail. That is, if somebody says, and actually lots of people actually said this, Flemming, if you publish these cartoons, we will kill you. Then the government's job is to protect Flemming, not to restrict him from publishing the cartoons. That is, you don't stop speech because of a threat of violence. If you do that, then free speech is meaningless. Anybody can threaten to silence other people, but it's exactly, that's why we have government. It's to protect us from those kind of threats. That's what it means to protect free speech.
But that is exactly the dilemma, because I think the vast majority would disagree with you on this point, and that is also why, in fact, within the broader public in Denmark, in opinion polls, there is a majority who supports this.
Really,
but they do it for security reasons. But at the same time, they say that free speech should also imply the right to offend. So that's, that's still good. But I can just tell you a short story connected to the cartoons that illustrates this point. In 2006, not long after the culmination of this crisis, there was an opinion poll in Denmark, and at that point, only 43% of the Danes thought it was the right thing to publish those cartoons. In 2015, right after the attack on Charlie Hebdo, 65% said it was the right thing to do, which is a constitutional majority. But then if you ask the same people, do you think Jyllands Posten should publish them again?
Yeah.
Then only 24% says yes.
Yeah.
That is about fear.
It's about fear.
And I worked inside Jyllands Posten until I quit, exactly because of this around this, and the threat was very real.
Yeah.
And what do? You have responsibility for 3,000 people. You don't want to estrange good reporters. You want good people to work there. You also feel a responsibility for, if Danish property is being attacked outside Denmark. There was a terrorist attack on the Danish embassy in Pakistan in 2008. People died. There were many planned attacks, either on the newspaper or on me or some of the cartoonists.
Also, the cartoonists were attacked physically.
Yeah, exactly. Kurt Vestergaard, who passed away a couple of years ago, he was attacked in his home on January 2nd, 2010. With a man came up with an axe.
No, this is a challenge, but this is why people like you are so important. People who have the courage to do it anyway. It's because if we all submit to the threats, then free speech is finished. Then it's dead. And it's again a slippery slope. So we stop offending Muslims, but then who's next? Who do we stop offending next? And so it's sad that people have to live under threat, and it's sad that people are not courageous enough to stand side by side with the people who take these stands. But submission is the worst outcome.
Can I ask you a question, Yaron, because I've been thinking a lot about this, and I agree with you, but I came to realize at the end of the day, when you have to pay a price, there are only very few people who are in favor of free speech. So I think it forces us to ask and answer the question, why is free speech important? Because, most people will say, well, free speech is important so we can exchange point of views. But, where do we stop when threats and threat of a terrorist attack, physical threats against a country, against embassies, and so on and so forth? And it turns out that for most people, a lot of people will say, and they also said to me during the cartoon crisis, well, we can live without cartoons of the Prophet Mohammed. What's the big deal? And in fact, an anchor of a big Danish news show said that to me. And then I asked her, well, I can also live without your TV show, so let's cancel it tomorrow. And then, there was silence.
No, so this is where I think we go back to, I think free speech is crucial for any discovery of truth, for human thinking. As we said earlier, what's the point of thinking if you don't act on it? Part of acting on it is speaking. We could go back to the days of real blasphemy laws, where people challenged religion and were burnt at the cross for challenging religion. There is no freedom. There really is no freedom in any sense without freedom of speech. Now, you wouldn't have published the Danish cartoons if not for you having seen the self-censorship going on in Europe around Mohammad. You didn't publish the Danish cartoons in order to offend for the sake of offending. You published the Danish cartoons in order to point out this phenomena that was going on in Europe, and it was, I think, really important and made a real difference. So I don't respect people who just offend for the sake of offending, right? If there's no point to the offense. But on the other hand, they have a right to do it, even if, so I don't particularly like people burning Qurans. I don't think you like people burning Qurans. What's the point? They're not making anything. But if we ban one, there is no end to what we ban. There's a lot of people who do a lot of things I don't like in lots of realms of life. But it's, as long as they're not using physical force against me, I have no right to stop them. So I'm very much for, we have to do it. And sometimes you have to take risks, and cultures who succumb to threats are cultures that are going to die over time.
And I think we are in for a rough ride in the coming years, if not decades, because you have this shift of power from the West to the rest. And I think, in fact, that the Danish law proposal against Quran burnings is part of that story.
Yeah.
Because Denmark, but the irony here is that it's a lot of people in other parts of the world, they don't understand this, and they see this as very offensive to Muslims. And we need, or the Danish government or NATO, United States, need the support of other parts of the world in order to impose their will on Russia in the war against Ukraine.
Yeah.
But I think the irony here is that we are saying that we support Ukraine in its fight for freedom, democracy, independence. And in order to do that, we have to limit free speech in our own country. I just don't think it's
absolutely true.
It's very incoherent, but that's geopolitics.
Yeah.
But then I just think that we should just drop that argumentation. And it turns out that some of the countries whose support we are trying to get by passing this law, they are might be even less, might be even more authoritarian than the current regime.
Yeah. So here's a question about Ukraine. So we've got a bunch of questions. Let me turn to those. So if Ukraine wins, what do you think freedom of speech, thought, and would look like in a Ukraine that has won, let's say? And what would be the major factor affecting that within Ukraine? What are the factors to look for in terms of freedom in Ukraine post-war, assuming they win, which is
a very big if, at least if you look at their own definition of victory, which implies chasing Russia out from all occupied territory, which I find I don't think it's very realistic, at least if you look at events at the moment. But I think it's a very good question, and thanks for asking it. I think we have been turning a blind eye to what is happening within Ukraine during this war, and that's very understandable, because we support Ukraine and we think it is very important to uphold the principle of non-viability, a violation of accepted borders. Mm-hmm. And if you accept the violation of that principle by force, where do we end up? So that is of huge importance. But I think, as soon as we turn this narrative into a story about dictatorship against democracy, if we want to phrase what is happening in Ukraine that way, then we also have an obligation to look at the way Ukraine is, managing these fundamental principles. Mm-hmm. And to be frank, that's not a that's not a nice picture. I mean, all political parties that are in favor of some kind of accommodation with Russia have been banned. Self-censorship is enormous. There are political prisoners in Ukraine. If you look at TV, they have uniformed all TV channels in Ukraine, so they only have one program running on all channels. Yep. Media freedom is quite limited. They had a new media law passed, digital media, which gives the government the right to close down digital media. And I think, I mean, all that is understandable in a situation where you're besieged. You need to stick together. It's far more difficult to accept dissent. But the problem is, if you cultivate this way of behavior, and if it works in a war situation, then it's very easy and tempting to continue doing the same thing when you do not have a war, or if you win the war and you have to build institutions and so on and so forth. And I think that what we should look for, of course, media freedom, the right for opposition parties who do not disagree with the current government's Western orientation. I think they should be allowed, sure. Even though we might disagree with them, but you have to fight that out in the political arena. But I think respect for minorities is very important. Right now, Ukraine has a very problematic language law, which makes it very, very difficult for Russian, Hungarians, Romanians, Jews, Crimean Tatars to publish newspapers, books in their own language. According to the law, in order to do that, they first have to publish it in Ukrainian, which means enormous cost. So you have to do every publication in two languages. And I mean, the European Council has criticized this. The Ukrainian government has said they want to look into this. But the problem with a society at war is that it quite often get less tolerant. It gets quite intolerant. So I think that is going to be one of the big challenges, so that the kind of national unification and the, this nation building project that is unfolding. I think my concern is that we should be very aware, and the Ukrainians should be very aware, that they should not build in an intolerant Ukrainian nation state based on an aggressive nationalism. Yeah,
it would be comforting to think that that Europe would place a lot of pressure on Ukraine if they want to do all those things, but who knows?
Yeah, no, but I mean, I do think Europe and United States has a lot of leverage, because one of the other ironies of this story is that Ukraine is fighting for its independence, but it is now less independent than it has ever been, because it depends so much on outside support. Sure. I mean, we are financing the budget apart from the fact that we are, of course, providing weapons support, but right now Ukraine would not be able to survive economically either. And then, of course, you can precondition that support on passing laws and having respect for certain kind of principles and things like that.
Let's see, we've got a few questions from Richard. He says, massive respect to Flemming for everything you do regarding free speech. It's the most important issue of our time. Where do you think there are young people who are interested in defending free speech? Where do you find those people?
I mean, you look for them,
Yeah.
you engage with them. No, I mean, I think a lot of young people have unspoiled instincts, and they want to be independent from their parents and the milieu where they grew up. So they're kind of tuned in, even though they might not be tuned in other ways within the education system. But I mean, I think there is a lot of space for making an impact on young people and teaching them, as you should say, to think for themselves and reason. And somehow, I think they understand that is what they need to do in order to make a way of living and to live a good life, and so on and so forth.
All right. Richard also asked, do you think the attitudes of Europeans are shifting in a positive or negative direction regarding free speech? Many Brits I talk to respect America's free speech culture. What about continental Europeans?
No, I don't see any. I mean, I think this is a story that has been going on for decades, and you might have a new law there, you might get rid of a law there, but I think in general the bigger picture is pretty consistent, and we are in a free speech recession. And the new thing within the past 10-15 years is that speech recession is not only taking place in countries like China and Russia, but also in the West. In the West, yes.
So Richard also asks, why would the negative trends towards free speech issues start after 1989? Do you think it was a lack of totalitarian communism in Europe that stood as a reminder of the dangers of speech restriction? Yes, so what is it about 89 that caused the shift in free speech?
Well, I will not only say 89, but I was just struck by the fact that these laws were all passed after the fall of the Wall. But I think it's, I think it's part of a broader culture that has to do with the fact that, this concept of harm, the concept of hate speech, the concept that we should not offend. Of course, we shouldn't, but this concept of the vulnerable human being, I think that's the biggest story about what culturally is happening in the West.
Would you say it's a primacy of emotions almost, that we value people's emotions so much?
Yes. I mean, if and we have to accept, if you react emotionally, we have to, we have to accept that as a fact of life and accommodate you in accordance with the way you react emotionally. But I think behind this is this concept of the vulnerable human being, that we are so weak, we are so vulnerable that we cannot be exposed to point of views that we might perceive as hurtful or provocative. And I think that is a very, very pessimistic and outright wrong. I mean, look at what human beings have been able to accomplish under what circumstances for thousands of years. So I think we should be a little bit more optimistic about the resilience of human beings.
I agree completely. Ginger asks, it really is about fear. She says, I had real concerns when I put a Je suis Charlie Hebdo bumper sticker, a tiny action in comparisons, and she still felt it. That's why I have such admiration for Flemming's fearless action. So good for you, Ginger.
I think that's very true. And I don't think, I mean, fear is a very, very real emotion. And I mean, I do not criticize and ridicule or mock people who experience fear. And people are different. I mean, I might have one reaction in this situation, but I might have a very different reaction in another situation. I mean, that's real, and everyone has to deal with it, according to the way you understand yourself and the situation you are in.
Yeah, absolutely. Frank asks, why can't we have? Why is it that paintings of Muhammad are banned? What is it about the image of Muhammad that is banned?
That's a very good question. The funny thing is that that there are a lot of images of the Prophet Muhammad within the Islamic tradition.
Yeah.
And if you look in the Quran, there is no ban on depictions of the Prophet Muhammad. It came later. There is in the Hadith, there is a verse there saying that it is only God that is allowed to create living entities, and that turned into first a depiction of human beings and animals and things like that, and then at some point within Sunni Islam, not within Shia. I mean, until some years ago, you could buy posters in Iran with images of the Prophet.
Interesting. Yeah.
But at some point it got banned, and I think it also had to do with power.
Yeah.
Because if you can depict holy figures, whom are you going to worship and not worship, and how it is going to be exploited. So in fact, in the beginning, it was just the depiction and not the cartooning of or the mocking of the image of the Prophet. But the bottom line here is that there is no ban as such within Islam on depictions of the Prophet as a foundational dogma. It's something that happened later in history.
Because it's in the Ten Commandments, because Jews, very religious, ultra-Orthodox Jews, don't have paintings. They don't allow you to draw.
It was also in Christianity. It was in fact the Second Amendment, but it was thrown out.
Yes.
It was in fact in the beginning also part of the commandments within Christianity.
Yep. No, it's the second commandment, I think. So it's the second commandment. So the ultra-Orthodox Jews take it very seriously to this day.
But it has also something to do with images as such, I think, Yaron.
Yeah.
Because images are very different than written words or spoken words.
Yes.
The iconoclasts and the way people get angry at images and want to destroy them. So images, and they also open for interpretations in a different way that written texts are. Yep.
So Scott asks, has free speech gotten better or worse since 2005? I think we've already got an answer for that.
Yeah, worse. And I mean, when you and I met the first time and back in 2006, I would say that the Western world was still in the driver's seat. But this free speech recession, I mean, it's also going on within our own societies. But I think looking forward, I think there will be more pressure on us from the global South, from non-democracies, to put more limitations in speech with references to religion, history, ethnicity, and so on and so forth.
Yeah. So you see this as having a real geopolitical dimension?
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, I think that the proposal by our government is right down that lane, and I think you can tell. I mean, I thought they had some very elaborated argument for doing this, But when they proposed it and they had to explain it, it just dawned on me they don't have a clue.
Yeah.
I mean, they haven't thought this through.
Yeah.
They are just finding some kind of ad hoc argumentation because either somebody told them or indicated to them. We think it's a good idea for the geopolitical picture in the world if you pass this, because it will be easier for the West to convince other parts of the world to join forces with us on this or that issue.
Wow. Paulo asked, does lack of free speech facilitate suppression and repression of the mind?
That's to you, Yaron. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think yes. As I said, I think when you take away the ability to act on your thinking, you limit people's ability to think. And people won't. There's a reason science explodes when we have relatively free speech, and there's very little science when we don't have free speech. People just don't think in areas that they're told they should not and cannot, and they might burn at the stake if they do. So maybe it takes a Galileo to be brave enough to challenge the authorities, but most people are just not going to go there. Whereas as soon as you liberate speech, suddenly people are thinking thoughts and creating things and discovering things that nobody could ever imagine.
Yeah, but don't you also have to be challenged sometimes in order to sharpen your mind? I think if you look at art and literature, a lot of great literature has in fact been written in societies that are quite oppressive. Take Alexander Solzhenitsyn or
yes, but
many other writers.
I think it's a lot more. It's a lot smaller numbers, and it takes a lot of courage for those few to do it. And of course, they know there's an alternative out there, and that's another thing. In a world where some people are free and some are not, at least the people who are not, if they have eyes, can see that there is that option, and they can stand up. In a world where everybody's unfree, I think the mind just shuts down. You know, I think there's an interesting experiment going on right now in China where for a long time, post-1978, the Chinese regime allowed, at least in the realm of entrepreneurship and economics and science and engineering, they allowed some freedom, and China exploded. And over the last 10 years, we've seen a slowly shutting down and closing. And now to be an entrepreneur is risky in China, and to come up with new scientific thoughts that might challenge some convention is challenging in China. And I think you'll see the consequence of that is if people are allowed to leave, they will leave, if anybody will take them. But if they stay, there'll be less thinking, there'll be less innovation, there'll be less progress, everything will slowly crumble, I think. You're starting to see that.
Yeah, I'm interested to hear your take on this, because I think I read in several spaces now that in fact, a lot of Chinese scholars are returning to China because of the anti-Chinese mood in the United States, that they feel discriminated in the United States. Is that the case?
I don't think it's a big phenomenon, but it definitely exists. Definitely fewer students are coming to America because they feel like they'd be discriminated, and they feel like there's racism against them. But I also think, the United States' immigration policy has become very anti-immigrant, and of course the first anti-immigration law America ever passed was against the Chinese in 1890 something. So it has a long history of discriminating against the Chinese. In spite of that, I believe that if tomorrow some administration in America said, if you want to leave China and you want to come and live in the United States, here's a green card, millions of Chinese would leave and come to the United States. But that's not going to happen. That's my fantasy, but it's not going to happen. But I do think, generally, I'd say over the last 10 years, I think American society has become more xenophobic, more afraid of the other. We've talked about the other as being much more afraid of the other. I think I think Trump's presidency was a turning point in American culture in terms of the first time for a long time, it's always been there. There was this real appeal to fear and a real appeal to the evil of the other. And I think a lot of people responded positively to that. And now it's become a part of American culture. And it's very, very depressing because, you know, when I came to America in '87, I had a much more optimistic, positive view of American culture than I do today. I'm worried and afraid for where the future is heading.
Is that because you were naive back then, or because American culture changed?
I think it's a combination. I think it's both. I think I was somewhat naive. You know, and a lot of what I knew about America and a lot of what I internalized about America was a certain romantic vision of that didn't really completely match reality. I wasn't quite as aware of the history and the extent of, you know, I knew about slavery, but okay, slavery ended, but the legacy of racism did not end, and it continued, and it was deeply, I think, embedded in parts of America. I also, you know, when I came to America, this is I don't know, you'll find this interesting. You know, Israel, as you know, I think, is a pretty secular country in spite of the religionists. And I grew up very secular, surrounded by secular people. Yeah, those religious people over there, they self-identified by wearing a yarmulke or something like that, so we know who they are. The thing that shocked me about coming to America was how religious America was, and how even secular people in America obsess about religion. That is, their leaving religion was a big deal for them. I became an atheist when I was very young, and nobody cared. I mean, you know, my grandfather cared, but nobody really cared. In America, it's a big deal. If you're an atheist, that's a big deal. And that was a shock to me. And I was very naive in terms of the impact of religiosity on American culture. And I think that has something to do with what's going on today. I think a religious mentality is a mentality that can easily be swayed towards these ideas of otherism and, you know, and towards fear.
Yeah.
But it's also changed. The culture has also changed. It's gotten worse. 9/11, I think, made it worse. 9/11 and the fact that, as we talked about at the time, Americans wouldn't acknowledge who the enemy was. It was terrorism, global terrorism, right? They wouldn't say the word Islam in the context of. I think that kind of evasion and that kind of fear and the lying, the politicians lied and manipulated the public. I think that changed. Then the great financial crisis eroded it even more. And I think Americans lost confidence in the American system of government, in their place in the world. And I think that was a real shock, which I think Trump just capitalized on.
You expressed optimism in the beginning, Yaron. That didn't exactly sound like an optimistic note.
At heart, I'm an optimist. That's the challenge, right? I want to believe that things are going to get better, and I do think they will ultimately. But the path there is a difficult one. It's not an easy path to get there. It's one that's going to require courage and fighting. It's going to require us to fight for our freedom. Every generation has to fight for it. There's no way around it. Quickly, Mark has a question about: are you still involved in Cato? And if so, is Cato doing anything around advocacy for free speech these days?
Yeah, I mean, I have an informal relationship with Cato. I'm not employed formally by Cato anymore, but yeah, Cato is engaged in the free speech debate, very much so, I think. And Cato is doing a lot of work on online moderation, which in fact is, the most important front line, I think, in the battle for free speech today. And you alluded to it, Yaron, when you spoke about the Twitter files.
Yep.
I was really flabbergasted by the fact that you could have the FBI, the White House, the CIA, all kinds of government institutions collaborating with big tech and NGOs, in fact, in
Yeah.
order to shut down accounts.
And-
And you know, the new demon out there, it used to be communism, or that's today disinformation, misinformation. If you can label something disinformation or misinformation,
Yep.
whatever that is, you somehow think that you have a legitimate right to shut it down.
Yep.
So don't be fooled by this concept of disinformation or
Absolutely.
misinformation.
Absolutely. It's kind of a, you know, they have a monopoly over the truth, and that's all that can be expressed. And of course, we know authoritarians have always done that. That is the path to authoritarianism. Always a pleasure, Flemming. Thank you. Thank you for spending so much time with us. I really appreciate
nice
it.
to see you, and
Good to see you.
I really enjoyed it, Yaron. So
Good. I'm glad. I hope we get a chance
I'll
to
see you
get together in
short,
person.
yeah.
Okay.
But you'll be in Copenhagen.
I will next month. So hopefully we can. I can see you next month. Good. I will be in touch.
Good. Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
This was wonderful. Thanks, Flemming.
Thanks.
Bye.